Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar organized by Funds for NGOs. Today's topic is developing a fundraising strategy for a recently formed NGO. I am Anutma and I'm here to facilitate this session. First of all, I want to thank each one of you for taking out time from your busy schedules. This webinar will run for 60 minutes, which includes 45 minutes of presentation, followed by a 15 minutes of Q&A session. If you have any questions or queries, please use the Q&A option on your webinar screen to post your question, and we will respond to them during the Q&A session. So let's begin with webinar's objective. So the first objective is be better prepared to understand what should be in place before you begin fundraising. Learn how to assess projects and prioritize in order to define fundraising goals and organizational needs. Gain greater understanding of the steps required and questions to ask when beginning the process, developing an annual budget. Learn how to develop a strong case for support and the different elements that should be included. Gain an insight into the different revenue streams that could be developed as a recently formed NGO. Be more confident in developing a high-level strategy with headings that can be for your NGO. Better understand the difference between a fundraising strategy and a fundraising plan. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the video section of the Funds for NGOs premium website. And now allow me to introduce today's trainer, Cheryl Hooper. Cheryl is an experienced development consultant and CEO of an international charity. She is an expert trainer and has provided training in capacity building to support international NGOs for more than 20 years. Cheryl has a BA honors degree in sociology and master's degree in international cooperation and humanitarian aid. She has successfully developed numerous award-winning programs and secured funding from USAID, UK8, Comic Relief, and several high-profile grant-making trusts and foundations with combined value in excess of $5 million US. She has been on the judging panel for the prestigious UK Charity Times Award for the past 3 years, a published author of a guide for NGOs in youth-led peer education, and was conferred a Women of the Decade Award by the Women's Economic Forum in October 2023. Now, I kindly request Cheryl to lead the session and share screen.
Hello, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to join me today. Fundraising, as we all know, is a highly competitive and challenging aspect for all NGOs. But for those of us where we're in newly formed or recently formed NGOs, this can be a tall mountain to climb and can be overwhelming. The more strategic and organised you can be, the better. And whilst it's tempting to begin trying to raise funds without a clear plan, just taking a step back to critically consider what funds you need to operate and then developing a strategy will help you build a firmer foundation for financial security in the future. So today, what I want to do is talk you through some of the things that I think you need to have in place when you are developing your first fundraising strategy. So we will be looking at how you need to be better prepared, what needs to be in place before you even begin fundraising, assessing your projects and prioritising them to really define what your fundraising goals are, looking at budget and what steps do you need to take, to begin the process of developing an annual budget. We'll be looking at developing the case for support, and then the potential revenue streams that could be developed to diversify income. And then I'm going to talk you through a fundraising strategy template so that you can use those headings and develop your own high-level strategy. And I'll just clarify the difference between a fundraising strategy and a fundraising plan. So whether you want to apply for grants or secure donations from individuals, businesses, faith groups, or any other means, it's important to make sure that you have the basics in place before you even begin fundraising of any kind. So any donor, whether this is an individual, a group, or a grant-making organisation, will want reassurance that the hard-earned money they donate is secure, that it will be managed properly, and it will be spent on the things you say, and that you have clear policies and practice in place to protect vulnerable people. So the very basic starting point is to make sure that you have the legal and structural readiness in place. So that's not just about having a management committee or a governance board, and a bank account, but it's all about developing internal financial processes and procedures. Making sure that your grant management and management of donations is watertight. And then also, of course, you're looking at making sure that you have a clear mission and vision statement and an organisational profile that explains what you do. You've understood what your theory of change is. What are you trying to do? And how does that align with your mission and vision? And then a draft case for support, which is basically something that you would need to refer to when securing donations of any kind. So when you get more established and feel more confident about applying for grants, it will be essential for these policies and procedures to be in place, and that you can prove that you're actively following these processes. Many grant makers will expect you to upload various documents and policies, and sometimes in grant applications you would be expected to explain how you demonstrate inclusivity and support different groups of people. So right from the outset, make sure that you have these documents in place at the start of developing and growing your NGO or community organisation. So we've talked about the financial procedures and policies that you would need in place, but you would also need to be developing policies like a safeguarding policy if you're dealing with vulnerable communities, fraud and whistleblowing policies which accompany the finance management and the financial manual, equal opportunities, disability, HIV in the workplace, and an employment manual and a recruitment policy, and also a reserves policy. And what I mean by that is for you to agree what your minimum operating levels needs to be so that you can always hold something in reserve. And we'll touch upon that a bit later. So whether you already have activities and projects that you're actively implementing, or whether you're thinking about activities to develop, this is a good starting point and basis for developing a fundraising strategy. So this exercise is a simple way to review the projects and work your NGO is doing, and then decide which ones are the most important and will make a difference to your beneficiaries. Which activities or ideas do you have which have real potential to make a difference, but may not be able to operate without sufficient funds? Which activities or ideas do you have which you think might be good, but their impact isn't yet proven? And then finally, which activities are you doing or thinking of doing that might take up a lot of your time and resources, but perhaps not providing the impact they should? So by doing this exercise, you can begin to really focus on activities that add value and make a difference, so that you can put your time, energy and resources into these and not spend time on trying to raise funds for things that perhaps take up a lot of time and resources, but don't have significant outcomes that you can track and eventually use to build your case for support. So reviewing your projects and activities in this way should help begin with the process of defining your fundraising goals and organisational needs. Don't be overly ambitious if you are a new NGO, and try and start in a small, meaningful way. By now, you should be clear on what activities and projects are important, so that you can begin the process of questioning, what do we need to raise next year or in a year? Can we break this down into core operating costs and costs for implementing various activities or a project? What costs do we need to cover, and how much do we need to raise each month or quarter or yearly to meet those costs? If you can break down the expenditure and costs into monthly or quarterly periods, you will then have a clear idea of how much would be needed for an annual target. So from the outset, try and make sure that your operating costs and fundraising target is achievable, or you'll end up running your NGO on a deficit right from the beginning, and it will be much harder to get back on track financially. And it's likely that your NGO will struggle with ongoing financial challenges. So the portfolio matrix is the beginning of the budget planning process. When you have made strategic decisions on which activities are the most important, which ones have the greatest potential to be scaled up, which ones add value, and which ones are draining your resources, you can realistically begin to work out the costs to run them. This will then form the basis of an expenditure budget and operating costs for the year ahead. So the next step is to forecast the amount of revenue that you can realistically predict to come to your NGO in the next financial year. So you may have already secured grants that will continue because they're midway through a project cycle, but there will also be other revenue streams that could be developed into a reliable source of income. So if your NGO is relatively new and has only been operating for a few years, this is when reviewing your past fundraising performance is useful. You can look back on past performance and see where you've been successful and where you have weaknesses. But whatever stage of development you're at, it's important to also consider how many operating reserves your NGO should be aiming for, because this is part of good governance and a way to ensure that you have sufficient reserves to operate for a minimum of 3 to 6 months at all times. So when you develop a fundraising target, always make sure that you include in the figure sufficient funds to keep in reserves. Now, obviously, at the heart of any fundraising strategy is the development of a strong case for support, and this needs to be tailored to your different audiences. So with so many NGOs competing for support, begin with looking at what makes your NGO or your community organisation different. Why should people support your work above others? If you're a newly formed NGO without a long track record, remember you can include things like the expertise of your team. Perhaps if you're the founder, you may want to include this. You may have lived experience, or you may have experienced professionals from a particular sector on your management committee. So all those things can support your credibility. Take time to develop a convincing case for support that explains the need for your work and the problem you're addressing, how things will change because of your work, and the difference your NGO will make in the community. And then prove your competence with a strong advisory group or respected network of individuals. And then this can be written up into a document that can form a capability statement, which you can give potential supporters, but also when you need to, you can extract information from it for grant applications. So take time to really consider the key message you want to convey to different audiences. And then, as part of a fundraising strategy, ensure that you develop a short one-page pitch that describes the work you do as an NGO and why that work is needed and the difference your NGO makes. So it's always helpful if you can also produce something like a short video these days, using a mobile phone even, which you can have as an online presence, with a website, a Facebook page, and those sorts of things, social media, because these days, these are all essential tools that can support all types of fundraising. So diversifying income as much as possible is a good strategy for long-term financial stability. So whilst multi-year grants are a good source of revenue, I've seen many NGOs struggle with funding because they rely on grants to sustain projects, but when the funding comes to an end, projects and staff stop working and the NGO struggles to function. So listed above are a range of revenue streams that I've found to be helpful to build and sustain income. So in your long-term strategy, aim to develop additional revenue streams outside the traditional area of grants. So depending on where your NGO is based, which country you operate in, and whether you're in a city or a rural area, will influence which of these revenue streams are most profitable. However, I think wherever you are, I do think that you could develop any one of those areas, if not all. So we're talking about individuals and regular donations as being part of a long-term strategy. And what I'm talking about there is regular support from individuals. So not just one-off donations, but, somebody who is giving $5 a month, for example. Exploring companies and business opportunities or working in collaboration with businesses, community events, seeing if you can secure donations from faith groups, looking at schools and schools fundraising. Now, obviously, in developing countries, you have schools that struggle with income because they are in very poor communities, but there are many international schools with wealthy parents, and it's developing links with those schools and asking them to support you in some way. And then we're looking at community fundraising and government contracts and paid services. So if you are a small or recently formed NGO, you may look at these and feel that these areas are beyond your capability. But the important thing here is to adopt a strategic approach and analyse which of these areas could be potentially developed and which would be easiest for your NGO given its current stage of development, the resources you have and the skills that you have within your organisation. A scattergun approach rarely works. And so if you randomly try different things without a planned strategy, it's likely that you will struggle to get the income you want. So the starting point is therefore to critically analyse the potential income streams available to your NGO and assess which ones you could realistically develop. Now, I did a training webinar a few weeks ago on how to develop regular individual giving. And so if this is something you want to develop, please take a look. It will be on the Funds for NGOs website. Once you have identified the revenue streams to develop, think about how much income you could realistically get. What strategies would you need to develop to secure that income? So just to give you an idea of how regular giving can contribute a significant amount each year to your NGO, I've put some examples of how funds can build up without asking individuals to make huge financial commitments. In fact, just on a very basic level, you'll see that asking an individual to donate just $2 a month could begin to form a solid foundation of financial support as you recruit more people to support your work. So a regular donation of $2 a month is unlikely to make an impact on many working people, and especially those in careers that are relatively well paid. So just on a simple level, you can see that asking individuals for different amounts according to their personal circumstances could bring in an estimated, on a very conservative estimate, more than $5,000 a year. And as you build the number of supporters, obviously that baseline target would increase. But of course, behind this needs to be a strategy which should focus on the number of supporters you aim to recruit and the different amounts you hope to secure from individuals. So here is a table of potential funding sources that, as a recently formed NGO, you could consider. And you'll see in the second column is an explanation about why that particular income stream would be realistic and viable for a new NGO. And then the third column gives some very brief ideas of the type of strategies you might follow. And of course, against each of these areas should be an area of the income target you're aiming for that covers the operating costs to run your programs and NGOs for a year. So what you would do is you would take each element of that and say, as part of your strategy, we will aim to recruit X, 50 new donors and raise a minimum target per year from those donors, and so on for each element. But building trust with donors is a necessary element of fundraising, and strategies to build trust should be part of your fundraising strategy. So it's not just about where do we get the money from, how do we raise the money. Part of that should be strategies about building trust. So for recently formed NGOs, try and keep your ambitions modest and within your reach and capability. So in the first 3 to 6 months, look to develop ways to build donor trust and loyalty and new small income streams. So one way to do this is to consider launching a crowdfunding campaign and have a fundraising target that is modest, such as $5,000 or $10,000, but also be clear on what you're asking potential supporters to donate towards. People give to make a difference and feel that their contribution, no matter how small, will make a difference and lead to tangible change. So use beneficiary stories, photos, and videos to bring your projects to life. And these would be part of the strategies that you would put in place. Ask friends and family to help kickstart the fundraising, and make sure that you give regular updates on any projects that you're requesting funding for. So if you want to know more about how to develop a crowdfunding campaign, I already did a training webinar on this topic, which again I'm sure you can access through Funds for NGOs. Okay, so grants are another income stream that can be developed if you're a recently formed NGO, but make sure that in the early stages of development, you should be aiming to diversify income and develop a range of different income streams so that you're not solely reliant on grants. To begin with, if you don't have a long track record, your strategy should focus on researching and submitting small grant applications where funders are keen to support new, innovative, or transformational change. It's important that you apply for grants that are within the scope and reach of your NGO, because a classic mistake for small or recently formed NGOs is to spend time on applying for grants that are beyond the scope of your capacity and experience. There are many small grant opportunities for NGOs with a limited track record. These are a few examples for you to look at, but of course there are several others for you to explore. So aim for fundraising activities that are within the scope of your resources and which could potentially provide you with some funds and new supporters. But each activity you do should have a planned strategy. So hosting a fundraising event or information session is a way to begin the supporter journey and build trust from members of the public. The important thing here is to make sure that you capture participants' details and you have systems in place to follow up, provide information about your work, and thank them for attending. And as you begin to build a pipeline of potential supporters, then strategies can be developed to nurture them and keep them loyal to your NGO. So developing regular giving from individuals is a valuable and worthwhile strategy that over time will provide your NGO with a viable income stream that can be developed and increased. So once again, it's vital that all supporters, regardless of how many that you have and how much they donate, should be thanked regularly. They should be provided with updates and acknowledged for the difference their support makes. Make sure that right from the very start, all individuals who have supported your NGO are looked after and feel appreciated. So a fundraising strategy isn't just about how much money you want to raise. It should include strategies to raise awareness through social media, networking events, and content on your website. All those things are necessary elements that support all types of fundraising. So make sure that you don't forget this side of things when you start developing your strategy. So try and document your projects and the change your work is making. Collect data to prove your impact and reach, as this will be needed as you become more confident in the work you do, and it will help prepare and help you to be in a stronger position to apply for larger grants when suitable opportunities arise. So if you haven't yet carried out a baseline assessment for your projects, then this is something that you should aim to do as early as possible, so that you have something to measure change against. So on a very basic level, you need to build a picture of where you are in the community or in the area that you're operating in before you start beginning work. and then you can start monitoring that change. It's important that a fundraising strategy isn't developed as a document that's just written and just left on a shelf and not referred to regularly. To be really effective in fundraising, it's important to track progress against the fundraising target. Put in clear performance indicators and make sure that you're realistic in your fundraising forecast and what your operating expenditure budget should be. So ideally, as well as tracking income, if you have the resources and capacity, you should also aim to track the number of supporters you have, whether they are increasing or decreasing in number, and what interaction and engagement you get through social media. So are people clicking through on posts that you put onto social media, for example? So by tracking these things, it should be possible to assess what's working and what isn't working so well, and as a result, where to spend your time and energy to develop and address things if they're not working. So if you're pursuing grant income, then there should also be a strategy behind this. And this should begin with a researched pipeline of potential funders, and then assessing what ratio of grant applications you might need to submit in order to gain a grant. So you can imagine, I'm sure some of you will have applied for many grants in the past and not been successful. So what you need to do is to really consider, on what ratio do we need to apply our grant strategy? So, for example, you may need to send out at least 7 applications to researched funders on the basis that just 1 will be successful, so that your strategy in forecasting of income is based on a ratio, in this example, of 7 to 1, or whatever you believe is realistic. So what I'm saying is, instead of just randomly sending out grant applications and then wondering why they're not being successful, when you really analyse it, you may think, actually, we need to be sending out a certain number of applications each year in order to make a certain amount of forecasted income that you think you can get from grants. And it would be up to you to decide what that ratio would be. So just to give you an idea of how to get going and a possible time frame to think about, here's a simple table that I've developed that shows you how you might develop your fundraising in the first 12 months of setting up an NGO from scratch. So you'll see here that in the first 2 months, the focus should be on making sure that all the various documents and policies that you need and that are necessary are in place to prove that you're legitimate and trustworthy and capable as an organisation. These should form a firm foundation for your NGO to establish credibility and trust with donors before you begin to fundraise. At this point, it would also be prudent to develop your case for support and make sure that this can be adapted to different donor groups, such as individuals, businesses, faith groups, and grant-making organisations, because what you say to each of those groups and the way you say it will be slightly different. And also the language you use will be slightly different. So it's important that this is also done as part of the preparatory work before you begin fundraising. So in the second and third months, you can begin to work on getting support from individual donors. But the important thing here is to really focus your effort on trying to convince people to give regularly, which is preferable to one-off donations. And again, here your case for support is crucial. So recruiting individual donors is best started by asking friends and family and business networks to help support your work through a small, regular monthly donation. And then if you wanted to, alongside this could be a crowdfunding campaign. And as you gain more confidence, you can think about researching small grant opportunities and writing grant applications for small grants. And this will help build your skills in writing about your work and help leverage bigger grant opportunities later down the line. So here you'll see the timeline that I've put forward, that you, just to help you think through the process of what do we need to do, how much time have we got, or how much time should we allocate. Obviously, this is fluid and it may not be exactly perfect for your NGO, but it's just there for you to really give you some guidance as to the timings that you should be spending. So what I'm saying here is to, if you haven't started, if you're brand new, don't even think about fundraising until you can get the basic preparatory work out of the way. And then as you move into the second quarter, you can start really becoming more strategic and thinking, right, what income, where are the potential income streams, which ones do we need to develop, how much do we need to raise, and what performance indicators do we need to put in place to make sure that we are tracking the progress. In the later part of the year, you're then looking at reviewing where you are in fundraising, making adjustments, and you may even be in a position to start looking at larger or more sums of money to raise from grants. So this is a fundraising template example for a 3-year high-level strategy. Now, obviously, a lot can change over 3 years, and this is why it's important to not just write a fundraising strategy and then let it sit in a room gathering dust. What you need to be doing is reviewing it every year. And alongside that should be a work plan. So this is a higher level strategy that really makes you think about the long-term vision of your NGO rather than sort of working on year to year. This is something that is more kind of aspirational, that will, what you can do is you can then take this document and then form an annual plan on the back of this. So what it is doing is it's giving you a big picture of where your NGO needs to go in 1, 2, and 3 years. Okay, and so the revenue streams that you may develop may be things that you don't develop immediately. The first revenue stream that you identify may be something that you only want to do in the first year, and then you build it, and in the second year you add another revenue stream, and so on. So sometimes people confuse a fundraising strategy and a fundraising plan, and they think that this can be one and the same thing. But as I said before, the strategy, think of the fundraising strategy as the blueprint for your fundraising. This is the big picture vision for your fundraising. And the work plan is the construction of that and the scheduling of that bigger strategy. So the strategy provides the overall vision, and the work plan details the steps you need to take to realise that vision. So once you've developed your fundraising strategy, you, as I said before, you may look at that big picture fundraising strategy and think, right, okay, now we're going to take that strategy and we're going to crystallize that strategy into an annual plan. So what do we need to do in year 1? What do we need to do in year 2? What do we need to do in year 3? And so that will then be broken down further into specific actions and tasks and specific work streams that you want to develop, allocating certain roles and responsibilities to different people to carry out that work. So just to reiterate and bring together what I've spoken about this morning, as I said, be clear that you have all the necessary documentation in place before you begin fundraising. What you may find if you're a new NGO is that you have some of it, but not all of it. And so what I would say is to go back and look and think, have we got everything we need in place? And if we haven't, where are the gaps? And then fill those gaps and make sure that you've got the necessary things that you need. And part of that is obviously your case for support. So define your objectives, clearly outline your funding needs. So as I said, look at the true costs of operating your projects and then break that down into kind of monthly and quarterly goals, and then that will help you define an annual operating target. Then you would be looking at researching the different types of funders for grants that align with your charity's mission, but make sure that you start small, you're not over ambitious, and they're within the capacity and capability of your of wherever you are in your development stage. Then make sure that you're grant ready. As I said, if you begin applying for larger grants, really analyse, do we have the capacity? Do we have the resources? Do we have the track record, or can we prove our capability before going for these larger grants? Make sure that you have a baseline assessment, because if you're new, this is the best way to prove your credibility and show the difference that you are making. And as I said, these days, it's always really good to record your progress with visuals. Use mobile phones, capture supporters' beneficiary stories, and send these to donors or make sure that they're aware of them. And think about your message, think about the case for support and what you are saying and how you tailor that to your different audiences. And then with your budget and your fundraising, make sure that you have a timeline so that you are putting into your fundraising strategy and your work plan deadlines for certain actions to be done, your financial projections, that you're reviewing them and assessing how much income and expenditure is occurring throughout your operating year. Okay, that brings me to the end of this training session. I do hope you found it helpful. I will be doing another one next week, which will actually be looking at obtaining seed grants for new NGOs. So you may find that of interest. But thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Cheryl, for insightful presentation. Participants, now we will begin the Q&A session. The first question is, how can a new NGO build trust with potential donors without an established history or prior funding?
Yeah, and good question. And I know that if you are newly formed and you don't have a track record, this is something. It can be a real obstacle. One strategy that you can think about is to form an advisory group or have on your management committee people who are respected in the field that you're working in, and who, if they have credibility and respect or are well known, that is a really good way to build credibility. So if you're working in the field of health, for example, community health, whatever, if health is your NGO, and that's what you do, then, on your management committee or your governing board, try and recruit health professionals who really are respected in their own fields and who would be willing to join your NGO. If you've already got a management committee, you can also set up a steering committee or an advisory board. So, that advisory board can be carefully researched individuals who you think would really, really add value to the work that you're doing. And who are really respected in their respected fields. So, you may have business people, you may have lawyers, you may have health professionals, you may have academics. Whatever you think is right for your NGO, then if you can approach people that you think would be appropriate to support your NGO, you'll be surprised if you ask some people would they be willing to be on an advisory panel. How many people would willingly say yes if they think that their help would make a difference? So you're not asking them to be part of the management committee or be having to give up huge amounts of time, but you could be meeting with them regularly. So when you are trying to establish credibility, you're talking to people, you can say legitimately, we have an established advisory panel and committee made up of this person, this person, this person, which shows that they endorse the work that you do. So that would be one way of trying to establish credibility. The other way is if you could get a patron to support your NGO. And sometimes a patron can be in name only. It's nice if you find somebody who is willing to turn up at events or willing to turn up at public meetings occasionally, that kind of thing. But just having a well-known name who backs your organisation is also another way of establishing credibility. So that patron might be a well-known celebrity. It may be somebody who is a esteemed academic. Whoever you think, as I said, it would be one of those things that you would need to research carefully and then make a direct approach and ask them if they would be willing to do that. So I think that's my best advice for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Cheryl, for the input. The next question is, how can a new NGO respond when the donor requests for audited books of accounts when you have not had any audits?
Yeah, I think that again is a very it's a difficult hurdle to come across. So what this is where you have to have really clear financial policies and strict financial systems in place. And I think what you would have to do is you would be going to obtain funding from donors who know that you are a startup. So if you are obtaining funding for the first time, this is where you would be looking for grants as a startup organization, because or you would be contacting that donor and saying, we have strict manuals and systems in place. Our finance manager is a qualified accountant. We have these are our systems, but it is our first year of operations, and so we don't have a full year's audited accounts at this point. So, you just have to be upfront with them and hope that they will accept that, or go for grants where they know that you're a startup organisation.
Thank you for your input, Cheryl. The next question is there training on how to set up a social enterprise that is profitable and the profits themselves fund the NGO?
Mm. There may be some training out there. I haven't actually done any training on that, but I can certainly consider it as a topic in the future. So the thing that I would say, the difference, if you like, between a social enterprise and a registered NGO or a registered charity, is that the accountability is different. So NGOs, registered NGOs and registered charities, their accountability is much greater. So, many donors support NGOs and charities because there is greater accountability, and they have to, there is strict legal requirements, and there are still legal requirements with social enterprises, but they're not. The grant opportunities aren't as they're not as frequent, as far as I know. But what I will do is I will certainly look at that and consider it as a possible training topic.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your input. The next question is, in the case the NGO has a registered entity in a country like US or some country in Europe, which only does fundraising, but the implementing country is like in Africa or India. Is this kind of a scenario negative for seeking grants from an established foundation?
Mm. I mean, my experience of that, I think it's a good question. I think that in the past, and really up until quite recently, that wasn't a problem. And in many cases, many grant making trusts and foundations wanted, or they want, an entity in Europe or the States, where they feel that the grant management and the financial procedures are stringent, and that their responsibility would be to oversee the implementation of the program in the developing country, like Africa, for example. So that's quite a common model. But recently, what's been happening is that increasingly donors have started to think, well, why do we need this middle management sector? Why do we need this layer? Why can't we just give the grants straight to the implementing organizations in different countries in Africa, for example? And so what's happened is that grant opportunities are coming up, and quite often there's a localization policy. So what's happening now is that there is a trend where grant opportunities are advertised, and you will get an international NGO looking at it, and they think, oh yes, that's exactly what we do, we cover that, but then they're not eligible because the donor has decided that you have to be locally registered to receive the money. Now, this seems to be a sort of growing trend. It's not exclusive, it's not happening all the time, but it is increasing. So I think that if you are an international NGO and your purpose is raising funds, which is then sent across to projects or to implementing partners in another country, I think that the way round it, but it's not ideal, is that you would develop that proposal and then you would send it to your implementing partner and ask them to apply. And so you would be doing the work, but they would be actually submitting the application. So I've done that in the past where I've worked, there is a fundraising organization based in another country, an opportunity comes up. They don't actually have the capability to write the proposal. So we've written the proposal, sent it to them, and they have submitted it. And then they have secured the grant because they are locally registered. So that is something that you need to consider really in terms of how you might work in the future, because it is a growing trend and you might find that this is happening more and more.
Thank you for your input, Cheryl. The last question, which is very specific. Our charitable foundation was established 3 years ago in Ukraine as a response to the war. We do have very good grant history and collaboration with large donors, but now we do have a big gap in fundraising because of many objective reasons. Is it a good idea to communicate this when we are applying to the grants?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's nothing wrong with. I think it depends on what the opportunity is and what grants you're applying for, and the donor. But there's nothing wrong with applying for a grant to a donor and saying that your fundraising, that the fundraising climate has changed, and that you require funding for certain projects. I think that it really depends on the research that you do and who you're applying to. I don't think that there's any harm in saying that you need funds, and you are struggling with fundraising, as long as you can prove that you're still operating efficiently, you're still operating your programs, that the quality of your work hasn't gone down and the outputs haven't gone down. I don't think there's any harm in that. But as I said, I think you just need to think about how you phrase it and make sure that you're not saying we don't have any money and so basically we're going under. In some cases there might be some funders who would support that, but I think you need to just look at the donor and decide which is the best approach to each individual donor.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your input. Dear participants, due to time limitations, we cannot cover all the questions posted here. As now we have reached the end of the webinar, I want to thank each one of you for your active participation, and we would also like to thank you, Cheryl. And on the behalf of the entire team and participants, please take a moment to fill out the feedback form for today's session. Your input is crucial in helping us to improve. If you have any questions, suggestions, feel free to contact us at support@fundsforNGOs.org. The feedback form will appear on your screen in a moment. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.